Awesome. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started here and give a quick intro to the session and to the folks on the call. And then we will dive in with a quick overview and recap of the blog post that Christine will give, and then we'll dive into questions. Hopefully, we'll spend the bulk of our time answering your questions. There were a number of pre-submitted questions that we're going to walk through. And then there'll be a little bit of time in that portion for you to ask live questions via the chat. My name is Evan Coughenour. I'm a partner with Bellwether based in San Francisco. I do a lot of our merger work here. In my prior life, I was a teacher in DC. I worked in the private sector doing merger work and corporate strategy outside of DC. I have an MBA from U Chicago, and then I've been with Bellwether for about 11 years. I have a wife out here as a school leader, two young kids, and work across the country in the education sector. Bellwether is a national nonprofit. We're mission oriented and we exist to transform education for students further from opportunity. And really excited to be talking with you today. We'll talk a little bit about why this topic feels so relevant right now. But before we do that, I wanted to give Christine a chance to introduce herself.
Thanks, Evan, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm Christine Wade, a senior associate partner on our strategic advising team. I'm joining you from the DC area. I've been at Bellwether for a little over 6 years now, but began my career in private sector consulting, where I started my work supporting organizations pursuing M&A. In my time at Bellwether, I've supported organizations across the education sector and across the country, as well as supporting a number of organizations in better understanding, considering, and pursuing mergers. So excited to be having this conversation with all of you today.
We'd love to get a little bit of a sense of who is in the room today. And so I think our colleague is going to pop some questions into a poll in the Zoom. And so if you can respond to those poll questions, and then we'll see the results of those quickly. Take about 30 more seconds to answer those. Okay. I think that has been sufficient time for the poll. Zoe, if you can close the poll, and then maybe we can see the results here. Okay, so you should all be able to see those results on the screen. Looks like a mix of different organizations, actually pretty even across the board. About a third nonprofit product or service providers, advocacy and policy organizations, and then consulting and service providers. And we have a smattering of charters and CMOs and philanthropic and other participants. Looks like there's an even distribution also of knowledge. So it seems like some folks are clustering on the three, not brand new to the topic, but not an expert and eager to learn more. And the where you're zooming in from, I actually can't see the exact results there, but we'll dive in. And the reason we asked about that is we know that geography, local context, regulations, funding dynamics influences mergers. And so geography matters. And we'll get into that a little more later. You all probably have your own reasons for coming to the session today. I think Bellwether has done work in the merger or strategic partnership space for some time and feel that the current moment is a particularly relevant time to be talking about this topic. So three big buckets of reasons why we are digging in more here. One, we see in the field increasing interest and a desire for knowledge, understanding of both what is happening and the best ways to approach mergers and strategic partnerships. At the same time, we also talk to a lot of leaders who have heard the topic, have been maybe pushed to consider it by their boards, but are also feeling stuck and unsure where to begin. And so we wrote this blog post and we're doing this webinar to give you a starting place for talking about mergers so that you feel equipped to make forward progress, even if a strategic partnership or merger ends up not being the solution that you go with in the long term. We do know, as I said, that context matters. While we will be talking in generalities today, every merger is distinct. There are unique financial considerations, unique programs that organizations run, and then mergers involve people. There are unique personalities among leadership teams, among boards, and those personalities matter when you're thinking about combining or forming a closer relationship between two organizations. Our hope is that today will provide some answers to your questions. We do not expect we will answer all of your questions, so be prepared to accept non-closure. For some of you, those answers may feel spot on and very tailored to your situation. And for others, it might just prompt deeper questions. Either of those responses are fine. We are happy to follow up after the session to continue the conversation and encourage you to just seek out other resources as you go forward. Many of you likely saw the blog post that we put forward, but I wanted to have my colleague Christine walk through that post quickly and give a synopsis refresher, and then we will dive into the Q&A portion of the call.
Thanks, Evan. As Evan mentioned, you might be here because you saw this post with 5 questions we encourage any leader to answer before diving into some of those initial steps of a merger exploration process. Even doing those initial steps is not without cost and risk. It takes time and resources away from day-to-day operations to explore a potential merger. And at the end of the day, the ultimate and best answer might be to not pursue one. And so before you head too far down that path, we encourage you to answer these 5 questions for your organization. And I'll very briefly talk through each. First, what is your long-term strategy? Pursuing a merger isn't a goal or purpose in and of itself. It's a path to achieve some sort of objective. So the first question to be asking yourself is, what is it that we're trying to achieve? Where are we relative to that goal today? And therefore, what do we need to do to get there? This leads to question 2. How does a merger fit into our overall organizational strategy? Mergers can be valuable tools to achieve some objectives, but they're not a magic wand that's going to solve any and all of your problems. So this second question is about identifying whether or not a merger would support the goals you have. Mergers can be good tools for certain things like increasing scale or revenue, looking to pursue cost efficiencies, secure new leadership, or attract and retain top talent. The third question then asks you to consider whether or not a merger is the best approach to accomplishing your goals compared to other forms of strategic partnership. A merger is perhaps the most extreme end of the spectrum, and you might be able to accomplish your goals with a less complex or perhaps less risky partnership option, such as cost sharing, contracting services, or a formal partnership structure like a strategic alliance. Now, after you've answered these first 3 questions, if it feels like a merger is the best path to achieve your goals, this next question asks you to consider whether or not you have sufficient capacity and resources to pursue a merger, and what, if any, supports you may need. I've alluded to how time and resource intensive mergers can be, and it's so important to go in eyes wide open here. This slide lists some of the biggest categories of resources and capacity to consider. The first is leadership bandwidth. Exploring and pursuing a merger requires a lot of board and leadership time and energy. Timeline. From the day you start initial exploration to when you complete integration to when you then actually see results and benefits materialize can span a couple of years. Legal counsel is necessary to help complete all of the steps and ensure you're meeting all of the regulatory requirements throughout the process. But that's not the only cost. There are a lot of expenses to consider, from additional staff time to support the merger exploration and integration to a whole host of possible one-time investments that may be needed. And last but certainly not least is change management. I think one of the most common pieces of advice I've heard from leaders who've pursued a merger is that you cannot underestimate the investment required in change management. With all of this in mind, the final 5th question recognizes that it's not just up to you. In order to pursue a merger, you need to have a willing and fitting partner. This requires first identifying the criteria that matter to you and a potential partner, aligned to accomplishing your overall strategy, and then scanning the landscape to identify who may be a good fit. Some of the criteria that we commonly see are things like mission alignment, organizational health, size, location, etc. So after you've answered these 5 questions, now what? If your answers suggest a merger is the best strategic path forward, move ahead with those conversations with potential partners and continue toward a more formal exploration process. On the other hand, if the answer is no, or you're not sure, which is probably the most likely answer, consider which questions and answers left you with uncertainty and what must be true to move to a yes. It might look like taking the time to learn more about mergers and the process, to build your understanding of what you're getting yourself into, and to build your confidence in your org's ability to navigate it. It might look like doing a deeper scan across the market to get a better sense for whether or not there are fitting partners out there. Or it might just be that a merger is not the right approach to addressing your strategic needs right now, but it may be worth revisiting down the line in your next annual or strategic planning process. And it's important to note that even if the answer is no, it doesn't mean this exercise wasn't worth it. It's really valuable for any leader to have the clarity of your long-term goals, potential paths to meet them, and whether or not that may or may not include something like a merger. I know that was quick, but we'd love to create space for any follow-up questions here. Now that we've posed the first 5 questions to all of you, we'll spend the rest of today answering your questions. We'll start by answering the set of questions you all submitted in advance. Thank you so much for those. And then we'll move to answering questions submitted in the Zoom Q&A box. So again, feel free to add questions to the Zoom Q&A box in the next couple of minutes. And with that, I'll pass to Evan to answer our first question.
Yep. And we'll go in order here. Christine and I are going to alternate answering the questions so you get a break from what she's speaking. And we'll proceed through each of these bullets. So the first question is, what are strategies for identifying a potential partner? So this is kind of a step beyond what we talked about in our blog, but is obviously a necessary condition for you to pursue a merger. One thing I'll say is before trying to identify a potential partner or narrowing from a set of partners, it is very important to have your board engaged. Your board needs to be aware that you're considering a merger. The board will ultimately decide on any final merger. And I'd say it's probably wise to have at least one board member from each side, potentially the chair, potentially another knowledgeable member, be a co-pilot through the process and engage in conversations. A second step, even before you start reaching out to partners, is make sure you're clear on your strategic rationale or your strategic why, as we talk through in the blog post. If you're not clear on what you're trying to accomplish with a merger, it's really, really hard to identify whether a given partner would help you to accomplish those goals. Once you have that strategic rationale, you can set up a hopefully simple set of criteria that I call it a strike zone. It lets you know which potential organizations would fit your criteria for a merger. And so if an organization needs to be of a similar size to you, that gives you a really good filtering mechanism. If you want the organization to be in the same city or within a certain distance from you, that gives you another great filtering mechanism. And what you want to do is start big with the universe of organizations, but quickly filter down to that set of potential partners using those kind of macro filters. And then you need to look at each individual organization and think about, would that mix of programs, people, particular characteristics, is that a fit enough to make it worth reaching out? And then you start reaching out to those partners. If you don't feel comfortable reaching out, you may talk to funders if you have mutual funders or funders that are knowledgeable in the landscape. If there's a regulator that impacts both organizations, if you play in common networks, you can try to solicit interest in that way as well. But at some point, you're going to have to make direct outreach. And I always suggest starting with a transparent conversation, but one that is low stakes. So not going in and saying, let's negotiate some sort of a deal right now, but let's explore. And I just want to pick your brain about, is this even a possibility for you?
And Evan gave a great segue into the second question, similar but distinct. What are promising practices to begin these conversations with a potential partner? And I wish I could give you a script. I would love that. But unfortunately, there's no one right answer. And it really depends on context, your relationship with this potential partner, a whole host of factors. But I think a couple of things I'd suggest keeping in mind is, First, prepare for this conversation by developing some key messages and questions that are anchored in that strategic rationale, and consider the value a partnership could bring to the counterpart. It's putting yourself in their shoes. Think about how they're going to feel when you show up to this conversation and start to plant these seeds. In a similar vein, I think the initial conversations are a really important place to focus on relationship building as opposed to come in laser focused on like deal making, right? So in this spirit, it might be helpful to start with less formal one-on-ones, ED to ED, or two-on-twos, ED and board chair with ED and board chair, and use this conversation as a space to start to test some of the early non-negotiables you might have in mind from both sides. This can help you learn early on if there are perhaps any red flags or insurmountable hurdles to a deal. But at the same time, I'd encourage you to stay open to learning more about your potential partner's values, strengths, and needs, which may help you test what is truly non-negotiable. And in that spirit, I think my last piece of advice is to enter these conversations with humility and a spirit of learning. I think that can go a long way in the first couple of discussions.
Next question is around what are early essential questions for two potential partners to explore if you decide it's worth having deeper conversations? And I bucketed these into kind of four subcategories of questions here: context, upside, downside, and feasibility. Start with context. So some understanding of where each leader, each board is coming into the process. How much consideration have they done? Have they talked to other partners? That's helpful to just know from the start so that you feel like you're on at least, if not equal footing, you know where each partner is standing. Then you want to think about, given your rationale on each side, what is the best possible outcome of the merger? What's the upside? Do the rationales match up? And what is the inspiring end state vision for the two organizations together? And that needs to be something that's compelling enough to go through the effort of a merger. If it's not, or it feels unclear, getting sharper on what that is really, really essential. After you've done that, you need to consider the downsides. Mergers have cost, as Christine mentioned, they take time, and there's risk involved. So you should try to quantify to the extent that you can how painful it will be to go through a merger. Maybe not at all, but most mergers you see will take a little bit of adjustment, change before the organization realizes that inspiring upside. With that downside analysis, you do need to think pragmatically about how compatible the organizations are. Is it that you have very complementary programs, skill set, staffing, geographies, funders, or is there a lot of duplication in those things, or is there sort of pieces that don't fit together as well? And that's going to impact the feasibility of going through with a merger. Other aspects that can impact feasibility, and I would honestly sketch these out on a napkin as you're having those early conversations. What could or should board and leadership structures look like? Nothing in stone, but start to have that conversation. It will be a sticking point, and so it's better to get into the topic early. If you have multiple programs that each organization is running, do those programs all remain? Do the programs get combined? Do some remain and some go away? Talk about like what would that look like? What could it look like? You should also talk about regulatory approvals. If you have, in the case of a charter school, for example, oftentimes a charter authorizer has to weigh in, and you need to be thinking about what is our strategy going to be on that front, and what is our standing with that regulator? What do we know about the approvals needed? And then I would also talk about how fast or slow each organization needs or wants to move and what an optimal timeline would be. Oftentimes, organizations try to close a merger at the end of a fiscal year and have day one of the merged entity be on a new fiscal year. And if your fiscal years are different or you are not ready to do that you might not end up doing that. But that close date and the day one of the merger should then backward map to a lot of your activity as you're thinking about exploring, negotiating, and ultimately deciding to merge.
All right, moving us into the second category of questions on strategic considerations with the big question: what are some of the key do's and don'ts when pursuing a merger? Evan and I put our heads together on this one and came up with 5 do's and 5 don'ts to elevate, some of which may sound familiar from some of the advice we've already given, some things you may hear again in the next couple of minutes, but that's because we think these things are really important. So first, I'll start with the 5 do's. Start with and remain anchored to that strategic rationale. I think everyone in this room probably has that memorized by now. Second is engage with your board from the start and be clear that a merger will require increased engagement from a handful of board members, similar to like an executive search process or something like that. Third, focus on relationship building with the leaders and board members of your potential partner. Fourth, make sure decision rights are clear as you head into each key decision point. And fifth, begin planning for change management and integration as early as possible. And then on the flip side, don't rush the process. Don't overlook misalignment in some of the big things like vision and non-negotiables. But at the same time, don't refuse to compromise or get too caught up in some of the minor details and lose sight of the opportunity for impact. Don't fail to include the voices and perspectives of staff, of families, of the communities you serve in shaping a new organization, especially in areas that they care about the most. And don't underestimate the emotional and cultural challenges of change.
Next question is how leaders should think about when to merge versus dissolve one organization and have it absorbed into the other. Um, and I will say that there's a little bit of a difference at times between how mergers are communicated externally and what actually takes place legally, logistically. Many things that we call mergers in the nonprofit sector, and even in the for-profit sector as well, are actually acquisitions. One organization is either absorbing another organization, or they are acquiring assets of that organization, or they are bringing on staff from that organization. And typically, there is a surviving entity legally, and then the non-surviving entity goes away. The board dissolves, the board members go away, even if some might join the board of the surviving organization. With every acquisition, though, there is a merger process, right? It is rare that you have an organization that just shuts down and some minor part goes into a new organization. There is people, there are programs, there are intellectual property in some cases, and then hard assets that you need to think about. What do we do with these things? And in most cases, the organization will take those on. In some cases, they might sell them off, close them down, get rid of them, but that often takes a little bit of time. It's rare that you have an organization that is continuing to wind those things down while the new organization continues. What this looks like is very, very context dependent. It depends on the rules of the regulator, legal conditions, as well as the individual wants and needs of the two organizations. But that's the sort of short answer to it.
Which is a great tee up for the next question. How can organizations partner without losing their identities? I'm going to start this answer by saying that in a merger, the type of partnership I think we're most focused on for today's conversation, it's unlikely that either organization can or should probably maintain exactly the same identity going forward. I think the focus should be on co-creating a new shared identity that fits the overall vision and draws on, the best aspects of each legacy organization. But even to do this, it's still important to start with an understanding of what your organization's identity is and what elements may be important to you or others in your community to preserve. And this starts with intentional planning and work that can happen even prior to consideration of a merger. Each organization should start by defining and documenting what is core to your organization's identity. What are the values, the cultural rituals, the legacy programs, etc. And which of these might you consider non-negotiables or at least high priority in a merger negotiation? Start some of these discussions early on in the process around how to preserve the important parts of each organization's identity. And then once you get to communications and the integration process, look for opportunities to carry forward and highlight key aspects of that shared identity, such as through major announcements or communications. And then from a people standpoint, I think a couple of thoughts come to mind. First is that the integration team should have representatives from both organizations to support this identity work from both sides, even if the relative size or bandwidth from each org is not equivalent in the go-forward entity. It can also be helpful to identify cultural ambassadors on staff who can help carry forward aspects of legacy identity and focus on supporting these folks with change management throughout the process. But at the same time, remember, this is a great opportunity to allow the newly combined staff team to shape the go forward identity and culture. So look for those ways to engage the new team in building a new culture, which can start as simply as finding time for informal relationship building that's not focused on a tactical, integration checklist or something like that.
Um, Shifting now and really have started to shift already and talking about leadership team and boards. First question in that category is how do you form a new executive leadership team? What should be taken into account when determining the structure and the membership of that new executive leadership team? This is this is a tricky question, and I will say in every case it depends. So I will give some general guidance here, but it is very, very context, individual, team specific. Um, One, I will say it is important to balance, as you're thinking about leadership team, to balance continuity with having the capabilities needed to lead through complexity. Um, as with all org structure decisions, form should really follow function. And so you need to have that vision of what do we want this merged organization to be eventually? What is our path to get there? And given that, what is the structure that we need now and in the future? And then there's going to be a period of change that you likely don't want to do all at once. But think about where do we start on day one of the merged entity? And then what are the shifts that we'll make to get to our end state over time? You may not have 100% clarity on that, but you should have a clarity on the end state and then what you're going to start with on day one. It is very, very important, and you will have to identify this during the negotiation process, who the executive leader is going to be, and that executive leader will then need to structure their team. And that will be a little bit of a conversation. Oftentimes, if the one of the merging leaders is not stepping down from their role or exiting in some way, they will continue in some fashion at the organization. And so thinking of the role for that individual, that's often a point of negotiation in a merger process. And you should think carefully about that and not imagine that that person will stay forever at an organization that they care about, but ultimately it's not their organization anymore. Um, you do want to think about not unnecessarily changing roles, but you don't want to have roles that are redundant or that you wouldn't have if you were standing up the organization from scratch. So I would think if you have two chief operating officers, I would not have co-chief operating officers unless there's like a clear geographic split. I think about differentiating those roles or maybe moving someone into a COO role versus a CFO role. The last thing I'd say is I would not feel compelled to assume that people with the same titles have equivalent experience and roles. Being a chief financial officer for a $1 million organization is very, very different than being a chief financial officer for a $50 million organization. And you should have a candid conversations about the skill level and expertise of those individuals and not be shy about shifting titles in ways that are appropriate to each individual skill set.
Our other question on leadership team and boards is around what strategies can help CEOs and boards get on the same page in initial stages of merger exploration, especially when things like personal status or legacy concerns may arise. This is a great question, and I imagine a question everyone faces at this stage in the process. A couple of thoughts come to mind. I think first, to be most effective in general, your board should always be anchored to your mission and what's best for kids and holding your organization accountable for taking actions and achieving results in support of that. And regrounding in that frame and responsibility may be valuable to both support the why behind exploring a merger, as well as to ensure you're all staying grounded in mission and impact, as opposed to other things like personal implications or legacy concerns. From the start, I think going back to some advice we've mentioned a couple of times, framing this conversation not as a decision to merge or not merge, but by anchoring to what is our long-term vision, what is the data showing where we are against that vision and the case for change, and then what are the options to achieve our goals, one of which may be a merger. It can also be helpful to anchor to the promise and potential for students, talking about future legacy potential, as opposed to focusing on loss of an organization, of branding, whatever it might be. And this shouldn't be done to shy away from this honest assessment of the risks and potential downsides, but rather as a way to remain grounded in that larger purpose of why we're even considering this. When it comes more to the sort of personal relationship piece here, I think at very early stages, the CEO and board should agree together on what merger exploration means. What is it that we're exploring? What resources will we allocate to merger exploration? What is the timeline for this process? And when and how will a decision be made as to whether or not to continue down the path? And it's important to be clear among everyone that a merger is a board decision. And then tactically, this is about real people. The question, is general to CEOs and boards, but this is the space where having those one-on-ones between the CEO or ED and each board member can be really important and unpack initial questions, reactions, concerns, feelings, because at the end of the day, a merger could mean significant changes for board membership and roles, and that change management starts from day one.
Last category of questions here, and then we'll dive into the live questions. We see a few of them here. Keep them coming. External stakeholders and context. So funders. What role can and do funders play in supporting mergers? And this is a great question. I think if you're considering a merger, you should reach out to your anchor funding partners and at the appropriate time, see if they'd be willing to support some of those efforts. We know from our conversations that lots of funders are considering this, and there's a tension because most funders don't want to inadvertently push organizations into a merger or imply that they must or should merge. And they want to be resources for organizations and at the right time and in the right place, facilitate that process. So funders can help with funding. That's maybe the most obvious way. They can also help with connections. Funders often are funding within their focus areas, multiple organizations that are similar. And so, as I mentioned before, they can be a resource for identifying potential partners and maybe even convening sets of multiple partners to do some sort of a speed dating exercise or ability to get to know one another in a context that is a little bit, earlier stage than it might be if you're approaching one-on-one to other partners. Funders can also have expertise, and many of them have been in operator roles, have seen mergers in other contexts, and so reaching out and asking their advice, and also just connecting to folks who are able to provide counsel and support through a process that will be, long and novel to most organizations and boards. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Another key stakeholder in this process, when it comes to charter schools in particular, is the authorizer. So when in the process should a charter school reach out to their authorizer? Starting with the grounding, authorizers have a key role in approving mergers or acquisitions between two or more charters because a merger or acquisition is very likely to affect material aspects of each school's existing approved charter. A good place to start in making the call around when to loop in your authorizer is to start to better understand your authorizer's orientation to mergers more generally. You can look at the policy the authorizer has in place if they have one, though many do not yet. If there is no policy, you can look at past practice related to mergers, as many authorizers have approved or denied mergers on an ad hoc basis, even without a formal policy in place. And you can also look for other signals from an authorizer that might suggest they're open to M&A. If there is a formal policy, you should follow those protocols, but in doing so, err on the side of early or over communication. And if there is no formal policy, I'd still err on the side of bringing your authorizer in earlier rather than later, so you're not getting too far out in front of your own process without some level of confidence that the authorizer might ultimately approve it. But it is a little bit of a dance. And I'd say regardless of whether or not you're actively considering a merger right now, it can be helpful to be building a strong relationship with your authorizer who may be helpful in whatever that strategic path forward is that you seek to pursue.
And then the last one here is on policy considerations, what to be aware of when considering a merger. Um, Legal and policy context varies from place to place, and so I'd look for your particular segment of the nonprofit sphere and particular geography. Make sure you're consulting the appropriate law. Bellwether is we have lawyers on our team. We do not provide legal counsel, and so I'd consult a nonprofit attorney, whether one you're using already or someone that's knowledgeable in the space. If you do not have someone on your board or on your team with that expertise. Um, Nonprofit mergers, broadly speaking, are governed by the Secretary of State in each state. Typically, for a general nonprofit, the stipulations and requirements around nonprofit mergers are fairly light. They typically deal with, dissolution of debt, what to do with assets, role of the board, definition of the surviving entity, things like that. But I would look that up. It's typically in the state code, and you can find it if you go to your state legislature. You may need a lawyer to understand what those terms mean in practice, but that will at least give you what is the law on that front. The IRS is also involved, also lightly. To if assuming both organizations are 501(c)(3s, you will need to file for a name change with the IRS. That is mostly a paperwork exercise. In some circumstances, the IRS might need to formally approve, but typically it's sort of a matter of course. Um, I think dealing with debts and liabilities or non-acquired assets in the case of an asset purchase, that's an area that can get a little more complex. If you're dissolving an organization and not taking on all the assets and liabilities, there needs to be some, you can't just leave those debts hanging out there. And typically, if you're taking the assets, you also have to take the liabilities. Or in the case of, a charter school that has facility debt, something like that. Sometimes the authorizer has a process for that, but it varies a lot place to place. Um, Federal grants and restricted donor funds are not a policy consideration, but you do want to be conscious of what are the commitments you've made to those funders. Federal grants being the most stringent, but funders may also have clauses built into their grant contracts that or grant agreements that you want to look at before going through with the merger. Um, if you are a charter school, charter authorizers, um, in the best case, have a very clear policy, but in almost every case, have a very significant role in the process and will ultimately need to approve the merger in some way. That is important to understand early in the process. It can be a deal breaker or a time extender in those mergers, and we've seen that happen on both the positive side of engaging the authorizer, where you actually are able to get to a better outcome because the authorizer helps add expertise and clarity, and then on the negative side, authorizers have kind of tanked potential mergers at the last minute, which causes ultimately like the bankruptcy of one organization often.
And with that, I'm going to take down screen share so we can focus on the questions coming in the Q&A box. I see a good number of really good and thoughtful questions coming in. Thank you all so much. I might jump in with a question I'm seeing pop up in a couple different ways, which is a question around timeline. How long do you see mergers take from start to finish? And in another sense, like how fast can you move if speed is of the essence? For example, if you're a charter school that realizes mid-year, this may be your best option moving forward. I hate to give another answer that says it depends, but that really is the answer here. But let me share a little bit of context about some of the things that inform how long or short you can go. I think I might think about the process as spanning a couple of phases. First is that sort of getting to a potential partner and agreeing to move forward in a deeper exploration process. This is a place where there's a lot of room and a big question mark in how long this takes. If you're already in a position where you have a potential partner in mind, you've been having some of those initial early soft conversations, that might not take a lot of time. But if you're starting from day one and thinking, hey, this is something I think our organization should look into and have no idea who that partner might be, it may take a little bit of while, may take you a while to think about the criteria, do a scan, start to have some early feeler conversations to get a sense for whether or not there's a potential partner out there. The next phase is the due diligence, this more formal assessment of each partner and getting to that real good understanding of the risks that you're getting into as an organization before making the no-go decision to move forward. This is another place where, again, the amount of time can vary. It might vary depending on the complexity of the organizations, the degree of difference in each organization, and in some degrees, the level of risk tolerance of each board and how deeply involved they want to be in all of the details. As ultimately, again, it's a board decision and their responsibility to feel confident in the outcome of the due diligence. Then there's signing, getting to the sort of high level design of the new organization, having board approval, and then getting that ultimate, authorizer agreement, for example, if you're a charter school. That again can vary depending on how easy it is to negotiate, how aligned parties are from an ingoing standpoint, what the process is for your authorizer policy, for example. And then finally, moving from sign to close and getting into that detailed design and implementation and moving toward day one that Evan mentioned before, which might be accelerated or moved back depending on the fiscal years of each organization, the timeline of the start of the new school year, any number of factors. So I think this can span, a couple of months. I've heard even a couple of weeks. I think we've seen for organizations who are, small, not complex, pretty aligned going into this, but it could take more than a year if you're really starting from square one and not sure what the path forward might look like.
There's a question around do organizations know what they are truly good at, their core competencies, and are there ways to think about segmenting those core competencies, having organizations be out front with programmatic services, others be more focused on back office? I will say organizations typically have a hunch of what they're good at. The level of clarity, accuracy in our experience varies depending on how connected and mature the organization's leadership and board are. If you have a leader that's been at numerous organizations in the space, they have a better sense of, okay, where are we truly strong versus not. It varies based on how much comparable data is there. If you're a school where you take standardized tests and there's lots of publicly reported measures, it's pretty easy to see where you perform strongly, and then you'll likely have a hypothesis about what is our special sauce that's driving that. For a mental health provider for students, it might be a little bit less clear how you're quote unquote performing based depending or relative to your peers. One thing that we do when Bellwether helps organizations with this is we provide a third-party lens and actually do a fairly quick assessment of each organization, both to say these are the areas where you're truly strong and areas where, not pejoratively, but you have room to improve. And then we also look at across all those different areas, where are the organizations really compatible, and where are there places where there's very, very different approaches, whether in terms of program or back office operations. It's a good question to ask early in the process, though, is understand like, okay, are we combining from positions of strength, positions of relative strength, or are we really going to need to sort of rethink most of what we do as we go forward?
Evan, you started to touch on another question I see around what are the benefits of having a third party help through an M&A process, and is it necessary? So I might add a couple things here and then invite you back in to share anything I miss. A number of benefits, a number of ways a third party can be helpful. Is it necessary? Not necessarily. And it's important to think about your organization's capacity, bandwidth, interest, what this merger exploration process might be taking away and straining from day-to-day operations that may be important to focus on in making this kind of decision. I think the places a third party can help sort of look a little bit different throughout that process I just outlined early on can be supports in helping to crisply articulate and identify that strategic rationale, what you are looking and solving for in a partnership, and what a partner might need to look like, the partnership criteria we've mentioned a couple of times, and then help with that landscape scan to identify and possibly even make introductions to potential partners for those early conversations. I think once you get into exploration with one or more potential partners, can support in facilitating or analysis within the due diligence. Again, knowing that ultimately that needs to be a decision made by the board, but can support a bit as arms and legs in helping to identify the places you want to look, helping to do some of the gathering and analysis and playing some of that back to support the team in reviewing and deciding. And then when it comes to integration planning and integration execution, can help think about what are all the decisions that need to be made, can support one or both sides as a sort of neutral third party in the middle to have those negotiations and conversations and draft through what some of the key structures and choices need to be for the new organization. And then in the integration process itself can range from serving as sort of arms and legs implementation support, managing the ongoing checklist, to-do list, making sure things are happening, surfacing decisions that need to be made, and those kinds of things across the team. So I'll just say there's a couple different ways that it can look depending on what your organization and team could most benefit from.
A couple agree with all of that. I would add that having an agreed upon process, whether provided by a third party and facilitated or from one of the organizations, is very, very helpful. Saying we're going to do these things in this order. This is roughly how much time it's going to take. If you are deciding where to go next at each step, it will take a very long time, or you may not get to the end. Speed is another one. Often when we work with third-party organizations, we can just move faster and help leaders and boards focus the time where it matters and not spend time on things that are maybe important but not urgent or just inconsequential to a potential merger. And then the last place is helping to convince ultimately both boards are going to need to approve the merger, and having someone that can make an even presentation on the merits of the case to each board is very important. And oftentimes it's hard to do that to the other organization's board. Um, where do you see charter M&A going in the next 3 to 5 years? I would say like generally more of it. How much more and where and exactly how, whether it's primarily single sites or primarily larger networks adopting smaller networks or mid-sized networks combining. I think that's going to vary by place and by the local market dynamics. In sectors where there are a lot of it's a mature sector with lots of single site providers, a place like, say, New Orleans, we've already seen as leaders, founders especially age out of leading schools, they begin to step back. In growing sectors where there are fewer constraints on growth, I think there will be potentially less M&A, but again, it just varies a lot by conditions, not just whether enrollment is increasing or shrinking, but also what are the regulatory constraints, what is the like landscape of providers, and how well kind of established is merger as a path in that place. Most leaders and boards don't want to be the first to do something.
And Evan, I'll build on that a little bit. We got another question just more broadly, not necessarily specific to charters. What are some of the trends we're seeing right now? And I think a lot of what you said resonates generally. But as I think more broadly, a lot of folks are grappling with the financial realities and amount of uncertainty at this time and thinking, ideally further ahead than a situation of crisis or last resort, to be really thoughtful and strategic about their long-term legacy and impact and being open to new ways of thinking about what that might mean and look like for their organization. And so we're seeing a lot of folks like all of you having the kinds of conversations like we are today to start to understand and explore something that maybe wasn't on the table for them a couple of years ago, but is now, in thinking creatively about what is that true sustainable path for impact, for legacy of our program and great work that we do, and might it look a little bit different than we thought it did a couple of years ago, but that's okay, and that might be better. And here are the things we think are important and want to figure out how to match with another partner or a different path forward.
And we'll do maybe one or two of these remaining questions, Christine, and then we'll wrap up and get you guys out of here by the top of the hour. Um, There's a question around deals that have fallen apart. This, what have been the causes of that? And talks about after being under LOI, which is letter of intent. I will say that nonprofit mergers don't always have a letter of intent as they do in the private sector, but there's the equivalent of that of two organizations going into, more of a dedicated process, even if there aren't mutual confidentiality agreements and those sorts of things. Um, Reasons vary a lot here. There's one sphere of reasons that is we've already touched on that authorizer or regulator says no, cannot do this, and that has not been anticipated in advance, often because that authorizer or regulator has not been engaged early enough in the process. Second is a board member or board members on either side pulling the plug because either they weren't brought along in the process or they disagree with how it's going or they decide this is not the best. It would not be fulfilling my fiduciary duty to go forward with this merger. Third reason is loss aversion, either among leaders or staff, feeling that the going through a merger, there'd just be too much lost or a feeling of too much loss, and that is not the legacy that they want to leave for their organization. For all of these, though, and generally speaking, it is not. I don't think it's a failure in all cases for a merger to not be finalized. It can often be the right answer for two organizations that go through 2, 3 months of conversations to say, this was interesting. We learned a lot, and this is not the best way to fulfill our mission or our goals at this time. We thought it might be, and it wasn't. It was good to talk with you. Maybe we don't take it off the table in the future, but at this time and in this place, let's either think about partnering in a different way or go our separate ways. And that's definitely not a loss unless one of the organizations is in, fiscal crisis and needs to shut down. Um, I would not see it as falling apart in a purely negative sense. Sometimes it's you have done the diligence and you say this is not the right path, and that's a great outcome. Christine, you get to pick the last question.
Oh gosh, so high stakes. I think since I've harped on the importance of this so many times, there's a great question here around change management and involving staff and the fact that mergers can create tension and concern among employees, which can manifest in a number of challenging ways. So what can leaders of an organization do throughout the process to involve and invest employees, even though they may not have a formal role to play and at times may be excluded from parts of the process? I think it's a great question. And another one, again, where it depends a little bit on your own staff and organization's culture and approach to change and change management in general. I think this is a place where you need to think critically about when and where transparency is helpful and when and where it might create more concern spin when you don't yet have the answers, and weigh some of the pros and cons to this question of, how early do you bring folks in to the fact that you're exploring this approach and process. I do think as you get further into doing some of the exploring, making some of the go forward design decisions, whether those be bigger or smaller, some of the small things could still feel really big to one individual if that impacts their day to day. And so think about the places where those who are closest to the work, closest to the future of a certain function or a certain approach or a certain element of org culture can play a formal role and can be a bit of a leader in driving something forward, and look for those opportunities to get them involved early so they can feel bought in and invested in the process. Anything you'd add to that one, Evan, before we wrap up?
Team and stakeholders, students, communities, families, should be front of mind in the process. And there's always change in organizations. Mergers make that change very immediate and quick and salient. And it's important to communicate with stakeholders that sometimes not changing is more risky than taking a step forward. I think it's important to consider the impacts on various stakeholders, and it is probably not the case that everyone is going to walk away and have everything that they want. And I would acknowledge that from the front and say what we want to get to is an outcome that is good for our mission, right? And gets as many people as much of what they want as possible while keeping us able to do the work that we're all here to do.
Great. Evan, do you want to close us out?
Yes. One, I would say there's some other great questions in here, and I don't know if we have the ability to get in touch with you, but if you shoot Christine and I a note, you can see our emails on the page here. We are very happy to answer these questions, have additional follow-up conversations, talk about your specific situation. We specifically did not do that in this session because we didn't want to out anyone and what your current context was. We recognize this is even joining this call is a little bit of an act of courage for each of you. And so thank you for doing that. We're glad to have you here. We're happy to answer all of these questions to the extent that we're able. And it was very good to see so much interest in this. We are just scratching the surface, but hopefully can provide some clarity and at least confidence in how to proceed in these important conversations. Again, Bellwether's our resource here, if helpful, and we would be delighted to be in touch with any of all of you and eager for your feedback and continued engagement.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.